Right, hello there. So today we're going to continue taking a look at IMVU Studio and normal maps in particular, because there are a couple of things that, particularly for room developers and furniture item creators, these won't necessarily be as much of an issue for clothing makers, because dealing with much fewer number of assets. Because when we're making furniture items and rooms in particular, the project files that IMVU uses are supposed to be limited to 2 megabytes. And you can imagine that as you start loading up all your assets, all your JPEGs, for everything that you see, so that's all your wood textures, your leather, carpets, floor, whatever it is, and then you add on top of that the normal maps that accompany all of that, and then your shininess maps, you can imagine that that's going to start adding up, and it does. So if you are creating rooms, you're likely to find, hang on, let me just you are likely to find that you hit the file limit, particularly if you work on the project over a couple of days. For some reason, IMVU Studio doesn't like modifying files after the fact, and it may give you file errors that basically allude to the project being too big. So the solution for that may be, when we are creating our assets, so let's just close all of these. So when we're creating our assets, what may be preferential for room create, this is really going to be for room creators, because there's no way you can create large rooms and have them full of textures. So if you have as with this backdrop scene, so this backdrop scene has 16 textures, 16 images, well 17 including 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So 17 textures. So with the accompanying 17 normal maps and 17 shininess maps, although we're using JPEGs, that's a lot of assets that we're loading into the project. So what room creators in particular may want to be thinking of is, so let's have a look at, where is it? So this is the lamp texture. And at actual size, it's that big. So it's 512 by 256. The corresponding normal map for that is, where is it? It's also 512 by 256. And the shininess map, where's that gone? It's also 512 by 256. So, relative to the amount of space and the clarity of the detail that we need to see on those objects, we may want to think about actually reducing the size. So let's just flatten this. So for the lamp and the detail that it may or may not have, so there isn't very much detail on this, what we might want to think of doing, copy, new, is resizing that to at least half size. For the normal map, well, we'll get to that in a second. For the shininess map, because what that does is pretty simple in respect to, it doesn't provide any detail, although there is detail in the shininess map, it doesn't actually provide any detail. It doesn't describe detail in this particular instance, at least. So what we could do with that is reduce that. So copy, paste. So we can reduce that to that, make it even smaller. So when we do this, the detail that we see in IMVU, although it's not quite as well easily visible in this for some peculiar reason, the detail is provided by the normal map. So what we could do is just leave that, so let's just copy and paste, leave that as is. So this ends up being our asset set. So we're using a quarter of that, and what is that, an eighth of the original. Yes, I guess that's an eighth. So that then means that we've freed up all of that and all of that in terms of data use in IMVU. And if we do that across all of our textures and asset use, we should find that we'll have a better project that's optimized better for IMVU. So for example, with the couch, where's the couch? So that's the couch texture. So it doesn't really provide too much detail visually, because again, that is provided by the normal map, which is here. So I don't know how clearly this will come through in the stream. The shininess map for that. Here, so this has already been resized. So again, for this, what we could do, because there isn't much detail, there's no stitching or, you know, bronze rivets or whatever it is. So we can reduce that to at least half. So we've still got the same sort of patina and the patination of the image, but our detail is being again provided by the normal map. So that also then means that we're using a quarter of the original for both images. So we're freeing up space without necessarily dropping the level of detail. So what you want to be doing with your projects when you're working on them, for rooms in particular, is taking a look at your scene. For example, the walls, they're going to be full size diffuse, which is what you see, the diffuse layer. Where is that? So we can leave that full size. We can leave the normal map full size, but we can reduce the specular map and make it much smaller. Because again, it's not providing any, it emphasizes some core details, but there's nothing particularly special about the shininess map that warrants using a full-size 512 by 256. So for the ladder and the shelves, we do the same thing. They are, by default, 512 by 256s. Close all of those. Where is it? So the 512 by 2 by 6 normal map, which is same size, and then specular or shininess. That's reduced in size, but because those aren't necessarily going to be feature elements, what we can do is reduce the texture size on the shelves and make those smaller. So we halve the size of that. Keep the normal map the same, and again use the smaller shininess map. Keep wanting to call it specular. It's shininess and specular is basically the same thing. Hello, Magic. So that's what we want to be looking for when we're working with rooms and studio. We don't have to do this with Classic, obviously, because Classic doesn't have the extra assets. But as soon as you start loading in your normal map and your shininess map, you are going to start hitting file size limits. Because even though Studio is built as the new great and wonderful tool, we are still working within the limitations that are present with Classic Editor. So you can't just go at your projects adding loads and loads of images if you're going to use the additional slots that we've now got. So that's bullet point number 1, texture map sizes. So I've done that. So in the previous video, mentioned using or not using JPEGs for your normal maps, and there's a reason for that. So let me just replace the wall texture. Preview. we have to wait. Right, so as discussed previously, the detail that we can see now is being provided by the normal map. So let me see if I can get closer to it. So that's the normal map doing that. So what I'm going to do is create a new normal map. Whoops. Flood fill. So this is just an image with a 127 by 127. Well, the color is, you can see in the corner, RGB 127 127 254. That's a flat normal map, relatively. Let's save this. Right, I'm going to save this as a PNG. .72, that's all right. Also going to save it as a JPEG. And depending on what program you're using, you'll have different settings for compression and all of that sort of stuff. Might not do it in this particular instance because well, we'll see. If I did it right, save. Right, so load those in to replace the normal map. Load image. Normal test. Someone needs to calculate the amount of time you spend waiting for the preview function to do its thing whilst working on a project. See how much time is lost basically waiting for that to update. So that's the wall with a flat normal map. Now I don't know if this will actually do what I'm intending it to do. So that's the PNG, which has lossless compression associated with it. So if we replace this with a JPEG version, No, it hasn't done what I was expecting it to do. But I can explain why you shouldn't use... So just looking at this. Yeah, it doesn't look as if it's actually physically done what I was expecting it to do. So let's see what the JPEG itself looks like in the image editor. No, it hasn't done it with this because it's probably a flat color. So could have sworn I had a JPEG. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. So this is a relatively noisy normal map because it has wood grain and the trim feature of the shells. So let's save this as a JPEG. Double check I haven't got one. So this is why we don't want to use JPEGs. Let's actually save this with a compression, progressive, okay. Then load in the JPEG. So that's the TGA, uncompressed. That's the JPEG. Yeah, and it has done what I was expecting it to do. So I don't know how well this is going to appear on screen because of the nature of a normal map and the artifacts that so let's go bottom corner. So this might actually be quite tricky to see, but it's worth testing this out yourself with a normal map. So if you create a normal map of something, it doesn't matter whatever it is, but it has a degree of noise. It's not just a flat normalized color, which is this purpley color. What you want to be doing this with in order to test this is to have a noisy normal map. So something that might have a slight wood grain, or, you know, so it could be a tabletop, for example. So what you want to be doing, if you zoom right in, you can actually see the compression blocks that are created when the JPEG is formed. And per the previous video when we were talking about this, what that does is it causes artifacts in the normal map. So in some of these areas, can't really see it without, see if I can get rid of the grid. Where is it? There's a way to disable. Oh, there we go, pixel grid. Right, so it's got rid of it. This might still be a little... Oh, we'll do it for all. Right, so the way that Jpeg compression works is that it'll, to use a word that might get it basically bastardizes the file, because what it's doing in order to try and compress the file, as mentioned in the previous video, it's creating blocks, or it chunks the file into squares, depending on the type of compression anyway. And what it might actually do in order to compress the file as aggressively as possible, so some areas might contain quite a lot of color tonal variation from the normal map. So we've got maybe 4 colors in this top quadrant, but in this bottom right quadrant there may be just 2. So what it'll do in some instances where it's very aggressive, it'll basically null out those colors that it sees, and it'll flatten it, so you lose the normalized data. And what that means is that when you load this into IMVU or your game or whatever it is that you, I mean this applies across the board if you use JPEGs. This is why you don't use JPEGs, for regardless of what you might read in the forums or elsewhere. Don't use JPEGs, because it'll introduce problems, because what we can see in the JPEG are boundaries between each of the compression zones, and the normal map will interpret those boundaries as structure. It'll interpret them as structural difference. So what you'll end up with is lines, aside from the actual detail that you are building into your normal map. What you'll end up with are lines where the tones differ across the normal map. And this is a little tricky to show, but the end result is often, let's just load that, see if it'll do it, even though it's the wrong normal map for this surface. Unlink preview. There. Oh, well, that's the detail that we were after. So that is our shelf edges. Let's try darker color. It might not be as noticeable on an expanse such as a wall because the artifacting is spread over such a wide area. But if you imagine this being on a shirt or an item of clothing or an accessory that's relatively small, it's more likely that you might see the artifacting, and it looks like a series of checkers. Oof, that's that's too dark or too saturated. Could make a cup of coffee in the time it takes to preview. And that is too bright. So let's go back to yeah, you can't really see it. It won't come through too well on video. But there is some very slight checkering. So, depending on what it is that you're doing, when you're working with your normal maps, when you save them as PNG. That way it'll force IMVU to use them in an uncompressed format that won't artifact, that won't show any checkering. If you use TGA, when you import those into Studio, Studio will convert them to JPEGs, I think, which will introduce artifacts. So by artifacts, we're talking about the checkering that can happen when we compress the file. So that's something else that you have to watch out for when you're working with normal maps. Let's see if that yeah, it'll do it. The more the busier the image, and the higher the compression. So there we can start to see it in our image. So these little checkers. These are not pixels, it's the compression grid. So if you have a normal map that's quite busy in terms of the tonal variations across the surface, you'll get increased artifacting where it checkers. So keep an eye out for that when you're creating your normal maps. So use PNG as your file format. Let me just close this and reopen this file. So the delay, I mentioned this previously, but the delay when you do something, so when you're opening a file, previewing or doing something, it is apparently because whatever it is that you're doing is being sent to IMVU for some reason, being verified, air quotes, authorized, and then allowing you to do whatever it is that you were trying to do. It's apparently a security thing, but the problem is it introduces a lot of delays in the project. So the third point, bullet point, is making your normal maps. So in the previous video, we took a look at making normal maps from images. So what we were doing was taking our diffuse image, so that's the top of our table, converting that to a grayscale image, whoops, which we were then loading into, in this particular example, GIMP. Because GIMP has a built-in filter. So let's just flatten that, copy. So we were loading that into GIMP, the grayscale. Oops. And using filters, generic, normal map, we were just converting that into a normal map so we can reduce the intensity of that by decreasing scale. But you want to be careful with that, so don't go above 10. And then the default settings are okay for IMVU. So we were using GIMP, or we were using a standalone app called njob. So that's normal job. So just paste that same image. We can't zoom in with this program, so similar settings, very basic. So we can increase the scale. And that produces a similar normal map. For room creators, for meshers, this is a quick way of creating normal maps, because the way that you should ideally create them is by meshing, relatively speaking, a higher resolution object with your detail in. Let me just set origin. What you want to be doing is creating a higher this doesn't need to be millions and millions of polygons. It just needs to be a high enough resolution structure that will allow you to bake some features out as a normal map. So you're baking the process of baking is a conversion process essentially. So you are converting the three-dimensional structure of this architriving, or whatever it's called, this pattern. So that's the edge of our shelf. And we've got our normal map, not a normal map, our where is it? Oh, I've put it in place. We've got our low resolution version, which is UV unwrapped, like so. And what we're doing, oops, let's make sure it's using the right texture. We want shelving. So shelving. And what we want to, in Blender, what we want to do is select the high resolution mesh, shift click the low resolution mesh. We need to switch to cycles render. So render properties, cycles, and we'll get the bake options available down at the bottom. So expand that, and we have our bake type to set to normal. So we've got all these different types. We want normal. And for IMVU, if you've used the starter file, we want to set the ray distance to at least 10, because this behaves relative to the scale of the scene. And because IMVU is 100 times larger than Blender's default, that does affect the way that texture baking works. So make sure that that's set to at least 10. So we've got our high resolution selected first, low resolution selected second, so that's the active object. Make sure selected to active is active, so that's enabled, checkbox, and then we just click the bake button. And that will bake that 3D structure. So this detail then gets baked as this. And then of course we can load that, save this out, save as, choose Targa Raw or PNG or a lossless bump map or TIFF file format and save. And then that can be processed for loading into IMVU. But, so let's do a quick, so let's say we want to add some edging to the table. So let's just select the tabletop. Let's hide the figures. So we'll select the tabletop. Ideally, you should do this at the same time that you actually make the original object, rather than after the fact. So duplicate this, separate. So that's Shift D. Whoops, wrong one. Shift D. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Duplicate, Shift D. And then what we want to do is separate. Because what that'll do is it'll give us a separate object that we can work on. And add some edge detail. So keeping it simple, all we're going to do is just loop cut. Loop cut. Scale along the normals. Hi, Ali. Yes, I'm not sure why. Not sure why it's slow, but it's being recorded, so once it's over, I'll upload the stream in higher res. What was I doing? Oh yes, so scale. Scale along the normals. Add another loop cut. Whoops, scale along the normals. Another loop cut. Just add a subdivision. So that's a very low resolution at the moment. Very, very low. But what we can do is just add our subdivision surface modifier. So this is all very, very simple, basic 3D meshing. Don't necessarily need to go crazy. Right, so we want a crisp edge along the top, which should be here, but we'll get to that in a second. Whoops. So another loop cut, push that right up to the top, and again, and we can see that that sharpens. Let's undo that. So it's quite a soft edge at the moment. So what we're doing is using loop cuts to define sharp edges. So if we keep an eye on what this leading edge looks like, we'll see its appearance change slightly. Let's see if we can get a better angle. So see how that changed? Edge slide, and again edge slide, and it sharpens that edge. Don't necessarily need to do that all the time. It just depends on what it is, the look that you're after. So we can do a similar thing to our corners, both sides. Across the front. We'll do a bit more to that in a second. Sharpen this little edge. Sharpen the bottom of the table. So again, loop cut, loop cut. And then sharpen that edge a bit more. But not super duper sharp. So we end up with that. Then we can increase the viewport resolution so that we can see what we're doing. And that can be our tabletop. So what we then need to do as this thing has a material already assigned to it, what we may need to do is create a new material. Texture scalding, not scalding alley, scaling, yes. Well, it's not so much texture scaling, but keeping an eye on the things that you need to be aware of. Using Studio, it's in particular with normal maps, because normal maps are going to be the ones that cause the problems the most, or cause the most problems. Right, so let's just separate that, just so that we have it. So we've now got a low resolution and a high resolution version. So let's just clear the materials from the high resolution. So again, we say high resolution, but it's not super duper. High resolution doesn't need any materials, and it's not millions of polygons. Depending on the texture size, you don't necessarily need to be making something with millions and billions of polygons. You just need something that describes the details that you're after, because we're dealing with 512 by 256 images, so you're going to be limited in terms of the amount of structural detail that you're going to be able to get into the normal map and still have an effective normal map. So this is why when you look at some of the early games that started to use normal maps, you'll see that the normal maps stuck with very prominent features to bake into their normal maps. Otherwise, all that detail, it kind of gets lost in the process of rendering the normal map, the texture or the material to screen. Right, so we've got our high res, we've got our low res. Let's check, double check. UV map. Whoops. So that's the UV map. So we want to select the proper. Might be better to just create a new image. So new. Let's call this tabletop bake. 512 by 256. Color grid, okay. So if we switch back to, oh, it's still disable that, disable that. And let's just switch texture temporarily to tabletop bake. So that's the image that we're going to replace. So select our high res, then the low res. Oh, this might be tricky. So make sure high res first. Come on, high res, then low res. We're in render properties. We've switched to cycles render. That gets us the bake option. We want to switch the type to normal. Set ray distance to at least 10. That's if you're using the starter files because of the scale difference. And then we should, oh, and selection or selected to active. So what that's doing is baking the high res to the low res. And then just click bake. Oh, and it's selected the wrong image. So this is where it gets a little iffy. clear all of these. Let's see if that forces it to do it. Tabletop bake. There we go. Sometimes you have to force it to do it by either clearing the materials or baking whilst you're in edit mode, which you can do. But we can see our feature, high resolution feature, is now baked to our low resolution normal, not normal, it's baked to a normal map that's assigned to our very simple, structurally that is, mesh. So it's just a flat side, but with this normal map we now have something that we can bring into IMVU as our normal map bake. So preferentially, if you can, that's how you want to be baking your normal maps. And what you can then do, let's save this, save as target raw, Taylor's bench normal, just call that bake. Because what you can do is once you've got your baked high res to low res, what you can then do is open that in your editor of choice. So we call that TGA. Where is it? Far too many assets. There it is, Taylor's bench. So what we've got is a very basic normal map with our basic structure. So this is the bit that we want to keep, or this is the bit that emphasizes or will emphasize, not in this particular instance because that's a slightly modified file than this one that's actually open in Studio. But if we imagine that if we were to load in a normal map that was so baked, it would then show via the rendering magic of IMVU Studio that pattern along the front of our bench. But what you can do as an addition is, so that's our basic structure. What we can also then do is, where is it? So that's our original diffuse. So it's a wood top. So what we can do with this is desaturate, get rid of all of this, and maybe not that. What's that? Right, okay. Well, what you can do is let's flatten that, copy. Let's drop that into GIMP. Yep, that's okay. Paste. Scale up just to make this easier to see. What we can do is convert this into a normal map, because we can leave the defaults. Okay. What we can then do, so this gives us our surface detail, and this is quite difficult to put into a normal map. Where is it? Put into the mesh itself as a high resolution structure. It's time consuming. So for room creators, if you imagine that you're having to create high resolution versions of all the objects you've got in your scene, so that's the ladder, the floor, the desks, the desk parts, the rolls of cloth, the shelves, the shelf holders, not the, you know, the shelfy, whatever these things are called, things that hold shelves up. You've got your shoe rack, your couches, the walls, the lamps. So that's a lot of work for a project. So if you're doing high resolution meshes that include fine detail, that's a lot of time that you're going to be spending making your normal maps using this method of baking from high to low. So a quick way, a cheap way of getting that sort of surface structure or surface detail is to bake your core prominent details as your high resolution mesh. So that would be your these bits and other things. And then what you can do is, once you've got your normal map baked, drop that into your photo editor, convert a noise or surface texture into another normal map, paste, oh, it's on the wrong one. Where is it? Yeah, edit, copy. Hopefully this will work. Yes, paste. Just paste it over the top. Use your filter or your, don't know what that might be called in merge mode in this particular application, but that might be called filter, or what's it called in GIMP? Oh, it's just called mode. So you use your mode, you want overlay. So it combines essentially your core structure with your detail. And that's just a quick way of adding surface. So, you know, the texturing. This is a wood texture. Let's just reduce that because that's quite harsh. Doesn't need to be too prominent. And then you would save that, export it, and that would be your normal map. You might have to renormalize just to make sure that you don't have any errant colors present in your normal map, because those can cause problems as well. But that's a quick way of combining baked normal maps. So you're using your high resolution mesh, baking the core features of your object to your texture and your low resolution mesh, and then you're combining that with a converted 2D image just to get you the surface detailing. And again, you know, once you've loaded that into IMVU, you then get your main detail and then surface detail of the wood grain. So that's 3 tips on working with normal maps. So one, change your relative size, because we're going to be hitting file limits with these on rooms. Large rooms in particular, if you've got a lot of excuse me, if you've got a lot of textures in your project, you're going to be hitting the file limit. So resize your images appropriately so that you have the detail being provided by the normal map and not necessarily a diffuse map. So again, we are, let's do the couch. So that's our couch. That's the texture that we see, or that's what we see in IMVU. That's the normal map. So the detail, the surface detail, is actually provided by the normal map. And then we have shininess or specular, which is similarly as small as the diffuse. So we're using is that 1.5 textures instead of 3 full 512 by 256s, and we won't necessarily have lost too much detail. Could have sworn it was a TGA version of that. Where is it? There we go. So that's the, because alternatively we'd use a full size one of those. Oh, I don't have a shininess for that. You'd have a full size version of the specular, and obviously there's the normal map. So we're reducing the amount of data that we're using from a texture point of view to about, what is that, 1.5 instead of 3. But we're not losing any detail. So that's issue number 1 to watch out for. Issue number 2 is your compression problems. So the artifacting that comes through with compressing normal maps using Jpeg. So where's that test image that we were just working with? Where it checkers, we start to see lines and blocks in the normal map that will be interpreted as structure. It'll be more visible in some than it will in others. So avoid using JPEGs for your normal maps and use uncompressed PNG. And when you're saving your PNGs, come on, filter dialog, just save them in RGB full color. Don't swap down to paletted, because that will cause even more problems. So we can, oh, we can actually see much better here. So we can see the way that the that's actually quite interesting. So we can see how the palletization has overemphasized the compression blocks. Whoops. Where it's reduced the colors down to just one color. So this is emphasizing or overemphasizing what the JPEG is actually doing, or what the JPEG has done to the normal map. And each one of these lines is going to be seen as an artifact in the normal map. But you don't want to be using paletted or reduced palette PNGs for your normal maps either, because that introduces similar, pardon me, that introduces similar problems to the normal map because it interferes with the color palette of the map itself. So it's introducing what's called non-normalized colors or tones into the image, and those will cause problems as well. So whenever you're saving your normal map, basically just stick with full RGB PNG without compression if you've got that option. So that's point 2, and then point 3 is the best way to make your normal maps is to bake them. So you're creating high resolution structures. They don't need to be millions of polygons, they just need to be detailed enough that you can see some structural detail. So all we've done here is created see if I can get to the all we've done here is just created some scallops or scallops. So all we've done is just simple shape, and that's baked to our normal map. That forms our primary detail. We save that, bring that into our editor, photo editor, image editor of choice, and then we can merge the two maps together with, where has it gone? Taylor's cabinet. So that's bake. We can then merge, copy, paste, using overlay as a quick way to create surface detail. So that is a couple of things that room makers in particular, but also furniture makers, are going to need to be aware of making their content for IMVU, because, as was mentioned at the very beginning, although Studio is new fandangled software, it is still built on top of the limitations that are present with Classic. That means the file limits. So you may start working on your big projects, well, even moderate projects, and find that you hit file limits. So you'll have to start thinking about optimizing your images. So, as for, there was something else as well. No think. Oh, yes. So, what happened? Oh. So when you are using Studio, this is for rooms in particular. Ooh. Come on, preview. So we've created a new project. derived from the room. So we've got our backdrop that we have to replace. So I'll just go through the process of importing the scene that we were just looking at. So this is the default that we obviously have to replace. So we're replacing the mesh, which is just a plane, and it's also got the two materials. So these are material 0 and material 1, if I remember off the top of my head. So let's just import 36, went a bit too far. So we get the setup FBX, scale 0.01, got our skeleton, so skeleton.room, let's get rid of all the helpers, we just want furniture and stage. So at this point all we're doing is importing the meshes, the textures, so we don't need all the avatar stuff, so deselect all of that. Just brought in all the materials, but if you're working with Blender, I don't know if this is the same for 3D Studio Max, you might note that the materials are actually listed out of order. So even though these are shown, or even though these are ordered in Blender, so we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then for the other mesh it's 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 16. So they are ordered correctly, but IMVU doesn't do that. So I'm not sure where that comes from, why this discombobulation occurs. Next, no animation, so that's fine. Review, blah de blah de blah, import. Yes, and there's waiting here as well. So it's brought in all our assets, as we can see on the right, no, the left, left, right, left. So there's the assets tab with all the assets. It's automatically assembled everything, but it includes the damnable example room and blue screen, because, and again there's a discombobulation. I have no idea why this happens. So the mesh that actually has 0, 1, 2, 3 well, I don't know about that, Nukes. No comment. The backdrop is the primary mesh, so the mesh ID for that should be 0. The furniture bits, that's mesh ID 1. So the materials have all been set up correspondingly. So the primary materials, 0, which start at 0, are on the backdrop, and then 5 onwards for the furniture item. But upon import, well, in this particular instance, it's flipped them. So mesh ID is 1 for the stage, not 0. So the furniture is mesh ID. So it seems like Studio thinks that maybe there are some missing material slots associated with the mesh ID 0. So you have to flip the meshes around. So you select the mesh or meshes, select the mesh itself, and then in Asset you select the mesh that we want to swap. But when we do this, click Preview. Well, I don't know if that's a big truth, nukes. I know nothing. It drops all the materials. But not only does it drop them, but it creates a whole list of new material slots that I have no idea what they are. But what we can then do is set up. So let's rename this. So we're going to rename. So the name of the object that's shown on the left here is created on the right under the name tab. So we call this stage. Luckily we can have multiple instances of the same name or label. Let's rename this furniture. .mesh. And then what we can do is select our materials. And what I've found is that as soon as you've done this, save the file. What was that one? 2, 3, 4. Because it has an awful habit of losing all your assignments. 5, 6, 7. See, all the material listings are all out of sync and completely discombobulated. Where's 8 gone? So 8's up there. So although we have to make sure that this is 10, make sure that we create our projects with IMVU compatible material names, it's not clear if, so this is 11, it's not clear if that's absolutely necessary anymore using Studio, because the default materials that we were replacing don't have the numerical identifiers, the numbers. So that's that square brackets malarkey that we always have to do. 12. 13. 14. 15. And then 16. So preview, hopefully this will do its So that's set that up. And then before you do anything else, what you want to do is save the file. File. Save as. I don't know what number this is, but just call it test. Because although we've overridden, so we've removed those two abominable references to example room and blue screen square plane shadow thing. These two things, they are no longer associated, come on, with our mesh. But that is a very long-winded way of fixing that problem, because otherwise they appear in our meshes. And that's just the it might just be that it's the names that are associated with the asset, but it's confusing because you can't just override that material name by loading in an asset. You can rename it, I guess, but it's not clear if that will. So let's just call this couch underscore 0. Because you would expect it to just override it automatically if you are loading in a new replacement. Oh yes, yeah. CHKN files and XMF, yeah. Well, there are legit reasons for needing those, but yes. So let's select our diffuse. What is that? Couch. Which one is couch? That's couch. Oof. I can imagine that the preview time is going to increase for the number of people using Studio. Oh, thieves, yeah, because thieves are using the XML files and the chicken files. So we're just replacing. But what that then means is that we have two instances of the same material. So it's an annoying thing that you have to fix, or that you might. Oh, it's giving us the two button things now. I think we just broke it. But it's for largely, I guess, for peace of mind, in the sense that what it means is that you're not staring at a project where the material assignments aren't wrong. So you have to swap the meshes. So in the component tab, meshes, we select the mesh if we're bringing in multiple meshes. Select, swap the meshes so that we associate the correct mesh ID. So this is how we assign mesh IDs in Studio now. We don't do it the opposite way, where we're actually selecting a mesh and then setting the mesh ID. So this would be our drop down with all the IDs listed. We're doing it the other way around, so it has a fixed mesh ID allotment. So we've got two meshes, so that's mesh ID 0 and mesh ID 1, and we want to then set the appropriate mesh section to the corresponding ID. So we have to do it this way around now, but that means that we can then sort out some of these problems where we have, whoops, oh, it's not doing it now. Which one was it? Oh, it's not doing it now. Isn't that the way? So it's now removed those errant material assignments. So yes, there's still quite a bit of unexpected behavior, shall we say. But so that's another look at Studio with a focus on normal maps. So for room creators, we're going to have to, room and furniture, but rooms particularly, we're going to have to keep an eye on our asset use, because it's going to be very, very easy to break through the 2 megabyte file limit. But texture sizes, bake your normal maps where you can, and then combine them with surface details in your image editor, and then use PNG lossless, just standard 24-bit RGB, so that you don't introduce compression artifacts into the normal map. Right, so I guess we can call it quits there. And that basically covers most of the stuff to do with normal maps. Shininess maps aren't too much of an issue. They're basically just grayscale versions of your diffuse. You might even be able to use the normal map and just flatten that and desaturate it. But you do have to keep in mind that in the same way that normal maps interpret tone as structure, so dark tones are depth, light tones are height, if we convert this to a grayscale image and desaturate it, obviously the darker tones will be a darker grey, the lighter tones will be a lighter grey, which may not actually align to the shininess that we're actually expecting on our object or our surface. So keep that in mind if you're going to do that, if you're going to convert normal maps into grayscale maps. The best thing to do is just use your diffuse and convert that or desaturate it. I mean, that's the simplest you can do, but that when you are making your normal maps, as we discussed previously, where's one of those template files? When you're making your normal maps from images and you're creating template files, which you're then converting. So this is a template. It's just grayscale all the way through. Copy. Drop that into GIMP. 2, 5, 6, 5, 12. Yoink. So when you're using that as a normal map, something to convert to a normal map, what we can do is use this template as our shininess map, but just with a little bit of modification, because this template corresponds more accurately, relatively speaking, to the structure that's going to be provided by the normal map. So we've got white corresponds to the highlight, dark to depth, which more or less is going to be the same with our shininess map. So where you've got dark and depth, you're going to have something that's not going to be quite as shiny as something that's white and highlit or highlighted. So hopefully that should be it for Studio until they introduce other features such as shadows and what's the other thing? There's something else. Ooh, is it? I think they mentioned ages ago that they might be bringing particles in. So it'll be interesting to see how that is going to work. So we might have a look at those once they're implemented and we can use them. But shadows should be interesting. So we'll call it quits there. So that's another 3 videos on Studio. 2 for normal maps. It's worth looking at normal maps for your projects if you're going to use Studio. But do keep in mind the limitations. And don't go crazy with your textures, because you will hit the limits quite quickly. Right, so thanks for watching, watchers, commenting, commenters. So that's Ali, Nukes, Magic, Andrea and Elena. And thanks for lurking, lurkers, and we shall see you on the next stream. So keep an eye out for the upload. I'll upload the higher res version of this later. Right. See you anon, as they say somewhere else. Bye for now.